Hope you're having a good day. Today I want to talk about a interesting cultural phenomenon that is occurring as this COVID-19 narrative continues to change, and there's a lot more acknowledgement within the mainstream about things that were known since the early days in 2020. And I want to focus on that by looking at a press conference that happened back in July with Dr. Kieran Moore. He's the Chief Medical Officer here in Ontario, and he's giving some insight on what some of the upcoming health guidance will be moving into the fall of 2022, availability of bivalent vaccines, what masking might look like, that sort of thing. He's talking to journalists about this. There's some very interesting interactions here that I want to break down, so let's dive into it.
Sorry, I just wanted to get clarification. If I'm a young, healthy person, should I be getting a fourth vaccine dose right now when Omicron is spreading so quickly and we haven't even hit the peak at this point? We're weeks away from that, or should I just wait until the fall?
So if you've had your first 2 doses and your first booster, we would not, you may get a second booster dose, but it's not a should. It is absolutely a may, depending on your personal circumstances. And again, you'd look at whether you have any underlying medical illness and or by your occupation, are you getting exposed to anyone, and or in your personal life setting. If your parent is undergoing chemotherapy, absolutely, you may want to consider getting a second booster dose, because it does have an ability to decrease your transmission risk. It wasn't 100% or high 90s like it was early on. It's around 60% decrease in risk of transmission, and then it rapidly deteriorates over months, the ability to transmit the virus. So if you have a question and it's not clear to you, please consider speaking to your nurse practitioner, your healthcare provider, to get any further clarity.
But 60% is better than nothing, so why not just recommend it to everybody instead of saying it's a personal decision?
Because at present we're doing a risk-based approach.
What's the risk?
The risk, there's always a risk to having any therapeutic versus a benefit. You want to make sure there's a very strong benefit versus the risk. If for an 18-year-old healthy individual, the risk to getting hospitalized if we have no underlying medical illness is very, very low. We know there is a risk, a very small risk, 1 in 5,000, that may get myocarditis, for example. And you'd have to have that discussion on the risk-benefit of a complication from the vaccine versus a benefit of decreased hospitalization.
All right, so the first thing I want to look at here is his acknowledgement of that, this is a therapeutic. Now, why is he using this language and why wasn't this language used before? I'm not 100% sure, but the key reason why this is important is because, a lot of times when we hear the word vaccine, we initially think that, well, we're talking about something that we get that inoculates us against something. We can't get that virus now moving forward, and we can't pass it on to other people. That's the perception that is put behind vaccine. The word vaccine itself also goes along with the concept of this just saves so many lives. These are the best things we have, right? But when you're thinking about a therapeutic, which is really just something that's like a medication, there's a lot different public perception around that. And medications are what? They manage symptoms, they help us feel better for a short period of time, and then after that we have to typically take them again. And with these particular vaccines, they are a therapeutic in that sense. They do not inoculate people against COVID-19, and therefore it is much more important to consider, the risk-benefit analysis of taking this particular therapeutic, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second. Now, one of the other key details he's kind of talking about in a little bit more, I'm going to say fervor, because the government and the media has begun to acknowledge over the last maybe 8 months, 9 months, this idea of rapid deterioration of the vaccine. But to be fair, this was known way back in the early days of the vaccine rollout on a large scale. And this was known because, as we talked about a lot on this channel, there was there was data that came out of Israel where, they were, I guess, further ahead, you could say, in their vaccine rollout because of a deal they made with Pfizer for, we'll give you early access, you provide us good data on how it's, succeeding if or not succeeding in your public. So we had a ton of data that we were able to see very, very easily that this vaccine was waning within months, and that by around 6 months, 7 months, we were seeing that the hospitalization rate for the ancestral strain and Delta strain was about the same as the unvaccinated. Once you reached that 6-7 month mark, right? And this is where the whole concept of boosters came in. And but the bottom line was that it was known. very, very early on that the protection against this vaccine, or the protection provided by this vaccine, would wane very, very quickly. Yet this messaging was never really passed off to the public. We were only ever really told that, hey, this is the best thing we got. This is amazing. These are going to, save everybody's life, this, that, whatever. And while it is fair to say that, yes, there was some success that happened with the vaccine, especially in the early days when you're talking about the ancestral strain and the Delta strain, they didn't disclose to the public how rapidly this protection would deteriorate and why, in context, why that is so important. So now, you see in these situations, these journalists are almost confused. I don't understand. Why would you not just be recommending it, even if there's a tiny, tiny benefit? Which gets back to this concept of Dr. Karen Moore says here, we're taking a risk approach. And, she's confused by that. What does it mean, a risk approach? What is the risk? Well, first off, the government has gone out of their way to never acknowledge vaccine injuries that are being recorded around the world in high numbers all over the place. Now, what are high numbers? We don't, if you want to put it into context, we don't know exactly, but the reality is it's right in the Pfizer trials themselves, you were seeing already 0.5% to 1% of people are going to have a severe injury where they're going to be hospitalized or they're going to have some sort of lifelong or serious illness that has to be treated, that sort of thing, right? We're seeing that there was a degree of injury that was not being properly disclosed to the public, degrees of injuries that were seen right in the clinical trials themselves, and that were hidden. And so now all of a sudden, what do you mean? What's the risk? Like, how is there a risk? Well, as Kieran Moore points out, for young people, for example, it's the rate of getting myocarditis might be higher than the rate of hospitalization for young people. And because COVID is specifically Omicron, but COVID in general has never really been hard on young people, right? So it's important to consider, what is the risk-benefit analysis of this? The challenge is that, really, if you look at the data, and data is a difficult thing to look at because there's different quality sets of data around the world, and not every country is keeping high quality data. But one place that is keeping pretty good data is in the UK, in their Office of National Statistics. You see that if you were to look at all the different age groups, you see, for the 18 and under, and then for I believe it's anybody who's 49 and under in general, all of those particular age groups, you see that the unvaccinated versus the vaccinated in those different age groups, there's not a huge benefit to the vaccine, right? So you see when Dr. Kieran Moore is saying, well, we need to look at the strong benefit versus the potential risk. He's speaking in nuance here, right? And when you're looking at some of these other age groups, the strong benefit is not there. For people 49 and under, there's not a strong benefit between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated when you're talking about something like all-cause mortality or hospitalization rates. There's a slight benefit for the vaccinated, but it's not a strong benefit. So because of that, you have to consider, well, what are the risks of the vaccine? What risk is this person incurring by being vaccinated if there's not a huge benefit to being vaccinated? Because remember, it's not like you're going to reduce transmission for much longer than a couple of months, right? So it's not practical to think we're just going to keep vaccinating people every couple of months, right? That's not going to happen. So at the end of the day, he's basically saying what people have been trying to say for a very, very long time, which is we have to look at the risk-benefit analysis of what's going on here. And, unfortunately, these journalists are very confused by that language because ultimately, at the end of the day, media, government has been spending a lot of time giving people poor language. And it's language that has not really given people a clear or accurate picture of what's going on with COVID-19. And at the end of the day, what we've been seeing is that all of the nuance, which he's now trying to inject.
Yes, with the nuances of the language that I'm trying to get across.
In confusing the crap out of these journalists, all of that nuance was happening in the alternative sphere. It was happening with different journalists and different doctors who were saying, hey, this situation is a lot more complex. We need to start looking at this in a much more nuanced way. And this was way back in the early days of 2020 and 2021, but is only now starting to be acknowledged in the mainstream now. And this is what I want to be clear about here is that I'm not making this video because, we've gone from the Alpha strain to Delta and now into Omicron. And of course, the government's going to change their mind because it's a much less severe outcome from Omicron. No, I'm saying that every single fact that they're now acknowledging was clear way back at the beginning of vaccine rollout in most places. So by let's say, even to be conservative, mid 2021, it was pretty clear already, based on the data we had collected from other areas around the world and the contributions that scientists were making to this discussion, it was clear that all of these things were going to be the case. And only now, years later, are we, kind of having this acknowledgement. And what's frustrating about it is you're seeing the effects of not having this complete conversation. People are confused. They don't know what's going on. Now, these are journalists who have their head in it every day. Think of what the public's like. The public is out there hearing all of these black and white statements. They're told that anybody who questions, vaccine safety, it's conspiracy theory. You look at Kieran Moore's face here, and he's having a tough time almost. In my view, I look at the smirk that's on his face the majority of the time, and I think, maybe what's going through his head is, he's trying to explain in nuance to these journalists who are not, quite understanding what's happening here. And he's almost like having to acknowledge the very things that were conspiracy theory, just weeks ago. And, this is, again, the issue when you start getting into absolute language that is not complete. Last thing I want to say on this is this. When you're talking about a risk protection approach, what that really is it's looking at risk-benefit analysis at the end of the day. Now, risk-benefit analysis doesn't just come in a vaccine or a booster vaccine or any therapeutic. It comes in other measures like masking, like lockdown, so on and so forth. And again, here's another moment where language was never used, right? One of our ongoing FOIA requests that we're still waiting on information back from the Ontario government is we sent a request asking for all of their internal documentation specific to what risk-benefit analysis they ran on non-medical interventions for COVID-19. So things like lockdowns, for example. So did they even assess what damages they would cause from lockdowns? Because when you're making public health decisions, you have to consider the totality of what is happening. You have to look at things holistically. It's not a reductionist approach where, well, if we reduce the deaths, we did good. Well, what if you killed 1 million people, but you reduced, some COVID-19 deaths? Is that acceptable to you, right? This is what risk-benefit analysis is. And again, this conversation is lost on these journalists. And the reason why it's lost on them is because it's the language that has been used from government and is a language that is used in mainstream media over and over and over again has created this culture, even amongst the public, where they can't think about this subject in anything other than black and white. And so when Kieran Moore says we're taking a risk-based approach, he's saying we're looking at risk-benefit analysis for the vaccines. Well, you look at who was saying, let's take a risk-benefit analysis on our COVID discussion as a whole, right? Any of the measures we're going to do, let's take a risk-benefit analysis. And what do you see? You see that way back in 2020. 3 very, very, esteemed doctors around the world from very respectable institutions came together and wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. And what the Great Barrington Declaration said was, hold on a second, we've been through situations similar to this before. We know what happens when we lock people down. We know what happens when we take certain interventions. Let's do this, because what's happening in the world right now is very concerning with regards to the authoritarian, lock everything down, shut everything down measures. They were concerned about that. And they said, here's what we could do instead. They provided all the evidence, all the data to support what they were saying. They said, let's focus our protection, i.e., let's look at the risk-benefit analysis of what is going on. Let's focus on the most, vulnerable people, and then allow everybody else to live their life, build up a community immunity, great word, and go from there. And so what happened when they came out and said that? Well, Dr. Anthony Fauci got together with his peeps and said, hey, let's take these people down. We need a swift takedown of these anti-lockdown doctors. And we know that because there was a FOIA request that returned his emails that showed that he wanted to do this swift takedown. So somebody, maybe it was in Fauci's own head, maybe he was just the puppet for this. I don't know. The point is, at the end of the day, this narrative of risk-benefit analysis that has been embraced around the world, that is now being embraced in this video, was presented in 2020. And it was specifically taken down as, these people are anti-something. They started using pejoratives against them. They attempted to smear them and destroy their careers, people that had built their careers over decades. And were correct about I shouldn't say they're correct. They were most likely right about the approach that should have been taken. It probably would have caused much less death at the end of the day, because there's an extreme amount of damage that happens when you lock everybody down. And some of that damage occurs in years to come as you miss, tons of medical screenings, as we saw. And so, we have to look at that and we have to say, how do we not make this mistake again? How do we not, get into a position as the public? Because the public's acceptance drives what politicians do at the end of the day. If we accept things all the time and we just play into their games all the time, then what they're going to do is going to stay. But if enough people sort of say, well, hold on a second, why are we censoring esteemed sciences? Why are we fighting with each other about things instead of talking about them, respecting each other, hearing out each other's word? This is the way forward, right? My video here is not a I told you so moment. This is hold on a second. Let's stop, take a breath, get back into our bodies here for a second, feel things out. What did we do, and how do we not let this happen again? And I'm not just saying this to, the crowd of people that watch my video. This has to extend out to other people. We have to start to acknowledge that if we don't admit that we took a terrible approach in the way we spoke about this, event as a community, and if we don't acknowledge that mainstream media deeply failed in covering this, and the proof is in these journalists' words, they can't even understand an ounce of nuance now that it is coming, right? We have to realize that where the failure happened, and we have to say, okay, let's learn from this. Let's respect each other. Let's move forward. It's the only way towards a thriving world, in my opinion. But that's it. That's all. Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to subscribe and pass it on to somebody else.